Energía eléctrica. Transporte urbano de personas.
Electric engineer, urban transport of people, two key sectors for Latin America's and the Caribbean sustainable development, not only for their contribution to economy and integration of territory, but also for their boost to social inclusion and protection of the environment. How do we identify the gaps of services rendered by infrastructure in these strategic environments for a region? What is the impact of digitalization in their evolution, the quality of services renders, and adaptability to the new normality? CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, presents the report on infrastructure in the development of Latin America. IDEAL 2021, the impact of digitalization to reduce gaps and improve infrastructure services. The report is seeking to take the analysis to the level of services rendered by infrastructure in the sectors of electric energy and urban transportation of people, with digitalization as a main focus. It checks the adaptations of the sectors in view of the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it structurally analyzes the interventions in what has to do with regulatory environment, public policies, and needs for investment in intelligent infrastructure in order to face services gaps as well as the effects that technological breakthroughs might have. Visit www.cioteca.caf.com and download the IDEAL 2021 report, CAF, Development Bank of Latin America. Good morning, I'm Lorena Toso, and on behalf of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, I would like to welcome you all to the launch of the infrastructure report in Latin America, IDEAL 2021. This is called the impact of digitalization in order to reduce gaps and improve infrastructure services. This report is focused on the services rendered by infrastructure with digitalization as a main focus, prioritizing the sectors of electrical power and urban transportation of people. It analyzes the digital breakthroughs that have been occurring, among them the advancement of intelligent networks in the electric sector, and in the case of people transportation, the use of informations and planning of trips, modality, and new payment methods. We also have a discussion on intervention in what has to do with regulatory, public policies, and the needs to invest in smart infrastructure in order to face gaps of services as well as the impact that technological breakthroughs might have. I also invite you to share in social media with our hashtag IdealCAF. This is the hashtag IdealCAF, and also follow us on the CAF Twitter. We wait for you to interact and get your feedback. We will start by giving the floor to Antonio Cerveria, Vice President with Infrastructure in CAF. He's in charge of opening this meeting. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Lorena. Good morning to all of you. Good morning to the speakers, also CAF colleagues, and all of you who are joined. Welcome to the 2021 edition of the CAF Conference on Infrastructure in the Development of Latin America. Unfortunately, today our interim executive president, René Lopez, was unable to join us because he has some other things in his agenda. That's why I'm talking. It all starts in 2011 when CAF decides to conduct the first analysis on infrastructure in the comprehensive development of Latin America. That's why we call it IDEAL. This publication was motivated by the joint effort of CAF, the Ibero-American General Secretariat, in order to do this analysis on the infrastructure development agenda for Latin America. The first document in 2011 was submitted to the countries in the 21st Ibero-American Summit of Heads of States, and it was very much welcome. This happened in October 2011 in Paraguay. The report becomes a reference publication on analysis of infrastructures, the challenges, also priority issues for the development of a strategic and regional agenda on infrastructure. CAV has also submitted 6 publications of IDEAL 2011, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, and 18. And this year now, in 2021, we have the 7th publication launched. Why we started year after year and then we had a bigger interval time? Well, this in fact is because infrastructure does not change so much from one year to the next. Challenges and bottlenecks are not changing so much. So we thought it was best to do it every 2 years. And last year, of course, we had the impact of the pandemic. Apart from the group of publications, this is the third edition of the Ideal Conference. The first one was in 2015 in Mexico City, and then in 2018 in Buenos Aires. EDL has contributed to maintaining an updated analysis of the performance of infrastructure in general terms and also by sector identifying the key factors in order to ensure the development of a sustainable infrastructure and proposing actions and priorities in the short term. This is a constant source for decision making in terms of policies and planning for research and for the private sector, among others. On the other hand, since the launch of IDEAL, there have been statistics that have to do with public and private partnerships in each of the sectors in the interest sector. The Infra Latam also that is shared by CAF, CEPAL, and IDF. In 2021, as Lorena mentioned, we're going to focus on digitalization and infrastructure, especially focusing on electrical power and mobility sectors. We will have a very interesting framework, and within the sequence, we also have the experts that are responsible for the development of the reports that will be talking about some details. And then we have a panel of political managers that it's really very interesting in order to address the digitization of infrastructure and especially the impacts on the urban mobility sectors and on the electrical power sector. So I wish you all an excellent conference, very fruitful discussions, and a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antonio Silveria, for your participation. We will now move forward with this introduction, and now we'll get into the report. We are going to learn about it, the IDEAL 2021 report. Let me say hi to Walter Korn, the main executive of CAF, and he's also publisher of IDEAL 2021 report. Welcome. Thank you very much, Lorena. Good morning. Thank you very much for the space you've given me, and I will present this edition of the IDEAL report after the introduction made by Tony, who gave the historical background of the report specifically. I'm going to start by taking relevant phrases of each of these 3 reports in order to understand the logic of why we are standing on this specific topic. In the report in 2011, we highlight the need to have investments in order to recover gaps and also to support unexpected growth, which implied a need to invest 4 or 5% of GDP. So that report was mainly focused on investment gaps. In 2013, the report in one of its chapters highlights the idea that that investment should be done in an efficient way within an efficient process, including project selection, the investment execution, follow-up, maintenance of infrastructure. So that is the title of doing more with less. And in the last report, the one previous to the current one, which was published in 2018, it talks about not just a need to have investment, but also to have a right operation of infrastructure and services rendered by that infrastructure. That's why in the current 2021 report, we focus on the services rendered by the infrastructure. We also define service gaps, which I'm going to mention in a minute. And also we talk about the electrical power sector and urban transportation. Since I have very little time in the presentation, I'm just going to highlight a few points, and I will invite you to read the report, the full report. So this year we selected digitization in this report. And so, first of all, we're going to explain this concept of service gap in this ICT sector, and then we're going to focus on infrastructure sectors of electrical power and urban transportation sectors. The third part of the presentation, we're going to very briefly mention the effect of COVID-19 on infrastructure sectors. A lot has been said about the pandemic and the impact it had on society, on the economy. I'm not going to repeat all of that, but just focus on its interrelationships with the infrastructure sectors dealt with here. And in the fourth block, I'm going to open a range of intervention options that will result from that intervention I will be talking about in terms of digitization and the selected sectors. That range will be open in three ways: suggestions in regulation, in public policies, and in the area of investments. I hope I have enough time to do this. I'll try to do my best. So, the first part of the report proposes an approach to the infrastructure services gap, and it does so in three dimensions. We think it's important to characterize the infrastructure service rendered to the user in the dimension of access, whether he gets it or not, in which quality conditions he gets it, how expensive is it for the system, and depending on the cost together with state policies in terms of subsidies, how affordable is it for the user? So we'll mostly highlight on residential users, but this triangle applies to all users: industrial users, commercial users, large users, but we'll mostly focus on residential users, even though we will apply it to electrical power and urban transportation of people sectors to emphasize it on the report, but we'll also work with some other sectors that have not been prioritized here, but will be prioritized in successive reports as has been planned, as water, logistics, just to mention two of them. So these three dimensions, let me also say that they have been recognized both in the sectorial agendas. If you see any electrical policy or transportation policy, and you will get these three dimensions, as well as in the world agenda. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals cover these three dimensions among the aspects that are relevant to be considered. So there is a conceptual framework that comes from sectorial agendas and from more global agendas that we believe makes this quite robust. And last, we also know that one size does not fit all dimensions. So it might happen that in a specific sector, there is an additional dimension to be addressed, and this can also be added as a fourth dimension. I might talk about sustainability, but there may be some other individual elements that are worth emphasizing. So that three-dimension division is applied in detail on the different sectors. In the case of electrical power, electrical energy, we thought about how to tell you a very detailed or quick story. And the way we do so in this very short space is through a traffic light that says after reviewing the state of situation in several Latin American countries, you might assess that there are not so many problems with access. The electrical power coverage is practically universal in the countries in the region, with several specific exceptions. Of course, you might mention the cases in Bolivia and Peru, both at a country level as well as in the rural areas. So green is, of course, behind that color. You have different cases, but the general situation is the one that has been described. In the cost dimension slash affordability, you might say that costs are relatively moderate, and that is also supported by the electric grid in the region. But if you compare the transfer of those costs to the users' rates and you compare it with the level of income, then there might be some kind of alert in terms of how affordable the service is. And then we might mention a low level of affordability. Last, the quality dimension is the one that calls most the attention. We might say a high number of long-lasting interruptions or disruptions, and that might make the system mistrustful, or the service rendered by the service mistrustful. So just a couple of examples to illustrate all of this. This is a case of quality in the electric power system in outages in certain countries and utility companies, with a number of hours that go beyond international standard in normal conditions. Generally, we have outages 2 hours or 3 hours a year. And here, if we compare it with the rest of the regions, except for Mexico, we have cases of 7 to 25 hours with a different variability. This is something that we should pay more attention to. In terms of affordability, we thought it was appropriate to illustrate, instead of doing it country by country, do it in an aggregate manner and compare the monthly expense of a residential billing in average consumption in the selected countries in Latin America that appear in the previous chart. And when you compare the expense with the equivalent expense in a country such as the US or the European area, you can see that it's a moderate expense, or a little bit lower. But if we compare it with the expense capacity or spending capacity of those regions or countries, you see the relevance of having an expensive service, and that might reduce the usage capacity for a group of users. Among the cost elements, let me just highlight one of them. There are some others also mentioned in the report, but let me highlight what one of the important components of cost, particularly in terms of infrastructure, is the total loss of energy, which are quite high in the region compared to some other standards in developed countries. And maybe digitization also plays a role in identifying total losses, especially because these total losses are generally distinguished between technical or not technical, and the main component are not technicals or the regular use of energy. Now, with a similar application in terms of a traffic light for the case of urban transportation of passengers, we presented city by city. The idea is not to have a comparison among cities. That is not advisable. But we can see that in each of the cities, through color identification in this case, but also indicators that support this visual presentation, we can see 6 indicators of service gaps in urban transportation. One that has to do with access, how long it takes for a person to take to a bus stop, being the main service, how much it costs, how much it costs for the user. It might differ due to any subsidy policies that may appear in the different cities. And three options of quality as for trip time, frequency, and level of occupancy. So the lessons that we might learn from this visual chart, you can see that the service is quite important in Sao Paulo, but it is quite expensive, and users perceive it as a busy service in terms of urban transportation. Buenos Aires, where I live, also quite important. It is expensive, but the local subsidy policy makes it affordable for the end user. Also with some quality dimensions that call our attention. In some other cities, we don't have so much detail, but so to speak, just the case of La Paz, which is the opposite way in terms of walking time in order to access to the bus service, also with a high level of occupancy according to the user's perception. So you might compare this city by city with an individual reading, and what also calls the attention is an indicator as, for example, the level of occupancy, which is common to all of the cities that massive transportation service is of high usage in general. So we can illustrate this with two examples, and I would like to move forward because the clock is ticking. One example is the case of transportation time. Just to mention that there are some cities where in less than 10 minutes you might get to a bus stop. Some others, this is not the case. La Paz is one of them. Of course, in other kinds of services, those sort of transportations are greater. It's also worth mentioning that in the cities where the bus transportation time is greater, there are some informal services that seem to have more importance, and that's also a concern for the formal urban transportation.
So this slide shows one of the quality dimensions, the travel time. In some cities, you may take longer with a public transportation versus private. And in some cities, the average travel is 1 hour and a half, or in Sao Paulo, Mexico, it's 1 hour approximately. Now, moving on to section number 2. The report, of course, has more details. I'm trying to give you an overview and some specific details that, of course, will be completed with a further reading of the report. But the second part of the report shows the progress of digital economy. Thanks to the convergence of the telco services, electronics, IT, computing, and a greater broadband in terms of capacity and geography, and also the deployment of physical terminals and mobile terminals, and the cost reduction in data transmission over time, what used to be a sector in the past is now a component which is part of every economic activity, but not just a component, but I would say a driver of many other sectors. And the sectors I'm going to mention later on are no exception. This has been facilitated by 4G, 5G, long-range networks, by the development of technologies as well, cloud computing, big data, blockchain. These are terms that today are part of any digital dictionary more often compared to 10 years ago. And with new equipment, developments, and digital advances that give us the possibility to improve the traditional internet, what we knew many years ago, where people, government, and companies were the data generators. And now we have Internet of Things or Internet of Objects. So basically, there is a data generation based not only on people or dependent on governments or companies, but also dependent on objects. And this is creating a revolution, not just in medicine, education, but also trade and the electricity sectors and urban transportation sectors. Now, making the best use of these service gaps that we have in ICTs, we saw the opportunity of applying this to the ICT sector. So the CAF index, the digital ecosystem index that has a very important scope in time, in geography, and is very much recognized as well. So this index, as part of a wide range of indicators, is able to identify the relevant elements for final or end users. And so in an aggregate manner, this index shows access, quality, affordability for users. This is made as an index itself. So we study a value that is met in a country. So the highest value is, of course, reflected in the rate in this index. So here we see a relative gap comparing the region with the OECD region. So this is one of the exercises that we have in this digital ecosystem index. And the region is lagging behind, as you can see, in terms of access compared to developed countries, also in terms of quality. As you can see on the chart, there is a need for improvement in terms of infrastructure and also affordability. It is quite expensive considering the income level. Of course, the report has a detail of each country in the region, and the situation is not the same in Costa Rica, Chile, and Brazil, where the performance of our indicators is higher compared to Paraguay, Bolivia, or Ecuador, where the performance of the index is lower. And we also were able to characterize this services gap in terms of access, cost, quality, and is evolutionary. That is to say, new applications emerge, so new gaps appear. This is what we call gaps 2.0. These are the most novel components of digitalization that are related to data, equipment, conversions of equipment, big data, cloud services. What about digital advertising, for example? And those are some of the indicators that we collect as part of the CAF ecosystem index, showing the evolution between 2009 and 2010 and 2019. So in the index, you can see accessibility by country. But for you to have an idea,
hay avances en la región.
In green and in red, there are more advances in the region in order to catch up with developed countries, particularly as has to do with digitalization of state, government transparency, electronic government platforms. This is not the sector where here at CAF, vice presidency colleagues, actually the three vice presidencies have this sector very much in mind. So this was an opportunity for me to show you the services gap that exists in digital aspects. Now let's move on to how the digital economy is part of infrastructure sectors. First of all, allow me to talk to you about the case of electricity. So I'm going to show you the context, the potential benefits for the sector, the service gaps, and then I will try to give you a suggestion as to how we could start applying the GAPS 2.0 in transportation and urban aspects. So I would like to start with electricity. We all know how a traditional electrical network operates. So electricity comes into the transmission and distribution network until we get to the end user. This is a traditional one. Now, a smart network is the overlapping of this traditional network with optimizing elements. So this doesn't occur in isolation. This occurs together with other digitalization processes, what we call decentralization, electrification processes promoted by the environmental agenda. So when we talk about decentralization, this means a small to medium scale distribution so that end users can also have a role in this micro generation and they can become electrical providers or suppliers. So instead of consumers, they are called prosumers. The development of batteries, more effective, more efficient, cheaper as well, that have capacity of storage and also of injection. And when we talk about electrification, we talk about electrical vehicles, as you can see here. And on the one hand, a new point of consumption of electricity appears, but thanks to the interaction between the vehicle and the battery, there is a development of processes to provide electricity to the network when the network needs it. And so these points are there just taking a rest, we could say. So the next point in this network, we have smart sensors, smart measurement devices that together with other elements make this interaction optimize the network. And this is what I'm talking about here. Thanks to the advanced measurement infrastructure, micrometering, for example, we can have a responsive demand. So if you think about the use of electricity in your households, how can you respond to that? Well, basically, the electrical bill gets to us at the end of the month, and so we can give a response, but on a monthly or bi-monthly term. The system also has a volatile cost. So if the cost variability can be visible to users through price time slots, then the demand could be more responsive, more reactive. So we could finally have a good interaction between the user to identify price differences depending on the hour or consumption patterns. Then the system is capable of detecting failures and restoring and troubleshooting faster. There are some models in certain countries. Or the use of assets. We can automate system components. Some components are already systematized. Of course, the electrical system has many automated components. But much of the distribution part has lots of potential. Also, distributed generation. And here, where I am pointing, if you think about your household, imagine that you have your air conditioning Imagine if it had a Wi-Fi signal, or if the refrigerator had a Wi-Fi signal. Of course, these are not mass consumption items, but imagine that existed for a moment. Imagine that many users could access those devices, and before or behind the measurement device, we could provide more efficient responses. Okay, so I hope that you had a good overview of what digitalization can provide to the electrical system. We have many benefits here, making generation and transmission more efficient, lower maintenance costs, trying to accommodate demand peaks. There is a need on the part of the system to have capacity, and the significant savings that we could have from managing the peak consumptions, for example. Another benefit would be a more integration with the renewable energies, more integration into consumer productions. This better integration of production as consumers, and as you can see here, there can be savings in costs, improvements in quality, or improvements in access, particularly in the rural component. This is very, very well explained on the report. So, we are an area of knowledge. We want to know whether we could apply the service gaps concept to this smart network. So the first thing we should ask is the access dimension. So this shows on the left how behind the region is. This was conducted through a poll in CAF assessing 2018-2019, where we asked people whether they had a smart meter device at home. And except for Asunción in Paraguay, and I will give that comment probably to the president of the region, the level of penetration is very, very low compared to developed countries, and there is a slow increase in the use of electric vehicles and also in consumers who could be active in that activity. Of course, the absence of metering devices is related to this, but these are the dimensions explored in the report, saying that this gap 2.0 is greater, but it depends on the digitalization of the sector. If we move on to urban transportation, some similar aspects could be pointed out. There are four main development aspects: information, travels, technology for transactions, and something very futuristic, but something that we need to consider, which is called integration of transport. Well, some cities have already started. The cases of Colombia and Chile, their capital cities, are cases of integrated public transportation. So, all in all, this would be a global integration as well, with private providers creating application models such as a mobility as a service, which is more European, we could say, or low demand mobility, which is more American. I will touch on those points later on. So these four main developments allow people to improve information in order to move around, to travel around, in order to improve information for planners, and better opportunities for individual mobility, Cabify, Uber, shared pools, or sharing cars, from the traditional car sharing when you travel to doing this in the city. And also what we call micro-mobility. This dimension also includes sustainability, people's health, so on and so forth. Then what we call technology for transactions. This is very important to have new methods of payments. In the two cities that I mentioned, and also in Buenos Aires, we have this type of new methods of payment. Digitalization is not alone. It is in hand with other developments. And in the cities, we have urbanization, the growth of cities. And this is all under the framework of sustainable mobility, which is very much driven by policymakers in the region. Potential benefits of digitalization in urban transportation, we can see it on this table. Of all the technologies that we mentioned before, many can have an impact in cost savings in trips, or it depends. If you replace a bus trip with a Cabify trip, it may be more expensive. However, it has an impact on the cost dimension. Less exposure time, particularly of women. This is important in terms of access. So these bus stops that could be optimized according to the flow of people. Also, the gender gap. This is something that I'm going to mention, and something that is a full part of the report, particularly in the urban transportation of people. So the question is, this triangle of dimensions in its 2.0 version, we wonder, are these developments being used in the region, just as the region is moving forward in micro metering applications? So we use the CAF poll of 2019, and we see an important number of people, from 30 to 40% in the cities which are in bold, people who use the application. This is very important. This indicator was not presented here, but it's on the report, and it says that 60% of the people takes a trip. So 30 to 40% compared to that base is an important number of people who use these information applications. And the stars you can see in Santiago and Sao Paulo shows that women use the app more, and the same for Bogota and Lima. So in the middle cases, Panama, Mexico have a low use of the applications. However, the cities in gray color, the application exists, but it is not very much used. So there is some room for improvement.
We also ask for the use in other features here, specifically for trips and micro-mobility. I introduced this in an aggregate manner. It's also open in the report by gender. There is dispersion in cities. Some cities use more trip applications, others less. In the case of bicycles and electrical scooters, you can see how incipient it was when the survey was conducted, but much of this has already disappeared in the region, specifically electrical scooters in the 2020 or 2021. So this takes us to the third part, which I'll be very brief, because as I said at the very beginning, I'm going to specifically focus on those elements that have to do with the relation between COVID and infrastructure sectors and the role of digitization. Of course, we have a review in the report of the pandemic, of COVID, and the impact in terms of the economy and social impact in terms of health and education. All of that has been mentioned in the report. But here, and You've also seen that in some other presentations. This is something that has been dealt with for at least 1 year, so it's really not worth going more in detail in that aspect. But it's worth mentioning some relevant points. First, there have been some changes in the localization patterns. Many of you are at home when you should, in fact, be at the office in normal conditions. And this is changing in some places in the region. It's changing as we speak, probably. But we've seen these locations patterns, and we also need to assess whether this will be permanent or transient. Second, also consumption or purchases for consumption have changed. This is something I would also like to highlight. In the past, we used to go to the supermarket to do the shopping, but now let us think about how many of those activities are now being done through the computer. And instead of you going to the delivery point is moving towards you. And this is what I wanted to, again, highlight from that on-demand mobility model, whose the main philosophical view is to adapt the movement of people and goods in an efficient manner. In the past, we're not used to having this. Of course, we had Rappi or Pedido Ya prior to the pandemic. Digital purchases on supermarkets also existed before the pandemic. However, all of those activities have changed now. We made a change of habits. So the question is how much of it will be permanent or transient. And also there have been some changes in mobility, and probably others, some of these will be solved with some time. So we have these three elements, and let me highlight that digitization has helped mitigate several of these effects, not just those that I've just mentioned, but in terms of health and education. And of course, having the technology and communication capacity also enables many other things that COVID in the year 2005 would not have allowed for. So there's a big task here. There's been some concern of whether the quality dimension was at the height of circumstances. Remember, in April, March last year, the change in the consumption pattern, a lot of internet usage at home generated some problems. So those concerns were relatively quickly vanishing, and now quality indicators were much better than during the pre-pandemic situation in the region. What is the weak indicator? The access indicator, and this is worth mentioning, especially for what has to do with education. These charts show the percentage of children in homes with no access to internet, and this is a basic source from and this is to show the deficit of access in normal conditions in several countries in the region. You can see here the black band, and for low-income home children, you can see it in light blue. So we welcome all the acceleration process in the vaccination program, and also the opening of schools in order to cover certain elements that digitization was unable to fully cover. And even if they had been able to cover them fully, this does not really mean that this is the best way to do so. But of course, this is not the space to talk about educational policies. In fact, it's not my métier, but we should show that infrastructure and digital infrastructure has played a role, and it also has had some limitations. Within the sectors that have been prioritized, the brief mention to the reduction of unknown mobility, the need for biosecurity policies. There have been some concerns about the informality of services and also payment evasion. But those are some topics that should be addressed more in detail. For a matter of time, I'll try to speed up. I think I only have 2 or 3 minutes left, and I would like to go to the last panel. Urban logistic, let me mention this. I think that there has been an important distribution task made here. And common to all, the last point here, you will see that financial feasibility is a serious problem. Let me very quickly go towards areas of action. I'll try to be schematic in order to honor time. I'm really sorry for the time I took. You know, I was really motivated. I'm sorry, it generally happens to me. But we identify 5 important changes: the emergence of new agents, new roles or activities, availability of data, convergence among sectors, and a group of distributive, environmental, and security effects that are important as a consequence of digitization. And we open those into 3 intervention batteries that are called regulation, investment, and public policies. So I'll be very fast to honor your time. So I'll make some very brief mentions. We should pay attention to the cost-benefit analysis as any investment project that has a cost-benefit recommendation next to it. We should do it at each of the technological stage within the sectors. There are some background in Europe, but not so many background in the region. I'm sorry, I'm really motivated with the detail of the report, and I cannot open now those 3 lines of redesign of sectors in electrical power and urban transportation. But let me say that digitization implies that the user, instead of consuming electricity, they can consume an added value service, electricity plus a lot of information that might allow him or her to adapt the consumption, specifically to spend less. Second, digitization has a potential if the distribution component is disaggregated from the commercialization component. And if we disaggregate this commercialization component, then we will have a possibility of competition on the part of users in order to have this added value. And it works better than in the case of one single provider. So if we have this disaggregation, then we should review the regulations and the appearance of players, of different actors as the distributed generation appears and there are different suppliers within one single region, then this would imply a greater movement of energy in a region, and that might be managed by a system operator and integrated by the general operator. So as you can see, there is a whole lot of interventions that have to do with the regulatory area. The same thing in urban transportation. The appearance of individual or pool trips are not always in hand with a regulatory framework, and that has not been defined. In some cities, it has moved forward, and in some others not, and this is an open point. Also, the rate schemes, the breakdown of rates, especially in the electrical sector, with non-conventional renewable sources and distributed energy. So the remuneration of the distribution component when it is separated from the commercialization component, all of this is addressed in the report, and it's important to have them in mind. The role of digital economy among sectors, this is another interaction window. Also capabilities of stakeholders from different regions. Investment, both in electricity from all components I've already mentioned, investment on those components, also urban transportation, the same thing, electric vehicles, not just investment in vehicle, but also in interconnection infrastructure, also operation with a network. All of that is addressed in the report. Also the treatment of unused assets, a separate box. In dynamic evolution, assets become disused and we need to remunerate them. What's the logic behind this? There are some background in conventional investment, but not so much in more novel investments. Finally, in public policies, and for a matter of time, let me just highlight two elements here. As we worry that the information on a credit card might be stolen when digitization is overlapping with the electrical grid, there is also a concern in terms of cybersecurity, and this will open the door to the policies panel and also by security, and it will also open this door. So these are the two elements that I want to highlight, plus some others that are also mentioned here, but for a matter of time, I'm not going to mention. I'm really sorry. It took me a lot more time than expected. I really thank you for your attention. I invite you to download the publication in cioteca.caf.com, and let's continue with our communication in dcs@caf.com. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Walter. We have a lot of information and findings from this report, from your presentation. Probably they will be the starting point for our two next guests. We will now be listening, and then we'll have a discussion on public policies. Walter was also mentioning this, and very soon we will have these guests so that they can talk to you about part of the debate and the discussion about this data and findings that Walter mentioned in the presentation of Ideal 2021. So the complete report, as we've just mentioned, can be downloaded from cioteca.caf.com. That's the site for you to find not just what Walter was mentioning, but also all the rest of the details that are still pending so that you can take a look about this very interesting data. And let me now move on to our two guests that we will be talking to. Ernesto Jabrowski, he's the host for the space. So let me welcome Ernesto. Good morning. Thank you very much for being there. And I'll give you the floor right away so that you can introduce our two guests. Thank you very much, Lorena. And thank you, Walter, also for the presentation of the report, and Antonio for the presentation as well. And now we are going to have two very important speakers who will be talking about our Ideal 2021 report. First of all, in relation to the electrical sector and the impact of digitization in that sector, we will be listening to Fernando Navajas. He's a chief economist of FIEL, Fundación de Investigaciones Económicas Latinoamericanas, member of Número, and also he works at the National Academy of Economic Sciences in Argentina, head professor at UBA and University of La Plata, member of the Torquato di Tella, and founder member of the Latin American Association of Economy for Energy. He has a bachelor's degree at University of La Plata and a PhD in economics in Oxford, and he's also a very good friend of all of us. Thank you very much, Fernando, for taking your time to speak about this report. Thank you very much, Ernesto. Thank you for your introduction, and thank Pablo and Walter for giving me once again the chance to be in with you and enjoy the launch of the Ideal report that, as Antonio said, it took some time, and now it's happening in full swing to give us some elements to work on, both within the academic environment and, let's say, the influencers of the economic policies, as well as those who will be working on that. In this couple of minutes, I have 10 comments, so I'll try to be really fast in order to take, on average, 1 minute per comment. The first 5 of course, will be to compliment you because I want to give context of everything that I've read about everything that has been presented by Walter, and the other five will be more reflexive. Because we should say that we need to be very careful now whenever we have a comment, because Walter will not be able to reply. So I don't want to leave any contentious aspects open, which I'm sure we will discuss later on, as we've been doing in the last few years and will continue to do so in the future. When you have such a report, and since you're not going to discover the will, because this is something that has been along in many of our multilateral institutions for a long while, it is very important to see the mixture of ingredients we will be working with. And I think that one of the attributes that make this ideal particularly good is the mix of those ingredients. It's essentially four angles, four axes that have to do with digitization, the electrical sector, the transportation sector, and COVID. It's not by chance. I mean, this is how it is today. Those four axes have been around. You can see that unlike some other reports that have been conducted on infrastructure in Latin America in the last few years, when you talk about digitization, you are including telecommunications. That is to say, the telco sector is also included in the infrastructure debate. We're not talking about the classical thing because we might forget that, and it's really been interacted with energy. So relevance for the political dialogue and specificities for the region. That is another important aspect included in the report. That is to say, CAF, together with the IDB and CEPAL, a little bit less, the World Bank has all of this thing of digitization as an important aspect. The second thing I would like to show is what has to do with the gaps in services. The idea of service has been along many years. Domisi Debrique mentioned this in terms of services. We worked on it with different contributions. I would have liked to see it more in this case, but it's important that among the institutions that are working here, we have to do some kind of cooperational thing. I would like to see this work of CAF exhibited by others and vice versa. But my third comment, an important organizer that was found by Walter in the report, because it organizes the way in which we will be discussing things in order not to go about the bushes, access, cost, and amount in gaps. And what the report also does, leaving the traditional perspective of investment gaps, is that it moves towards the quantification of gaps that leads to the traffic lights. These are heat maps, road maps, that is to say, things that will talk about the useful things that you can do. So it organizes us. A fourth comment has to do with the fact that there is another order within this word. Maybe it's not so much exposed when Walter mentioned this, but this is the mix of industrial organization and regulation. Here, everything is being moved upside down. So we need to understand what's happening with the design or the redesign of the electrical market, the environment of the electrical market, together with pricing and the regulatory design. So it's a mix of things that have to do with organization forward in order to discuss rates and how we can improve the management of demand. So we also need to have this idea that Walter also mentioned it when he saw and when he showed the charts, and it has to do with the appearance of new markets that are going around. And the fifth and very important one, which is everything has been thought in order to present a heat map or a road map in terms of priorities. It was mentioned really fast in the end, but we have regulatory changes, investments, and everything that has to do with social and environmental policies.
So now I'm going to move on to the next 5 comments that are a point of reflection. And I think that the COVID is not one more thing. I loved the COVID chapter. I really like the implications on the people, on mobility, on demand. But I think that COVID adds an element that we didn't have on the radar, something that we had been working on because these things existed before digitalization. And this is what we call the extreme events. So, if there is a benchmarking of shocks in Latin America and OECD, and we see that trade and hospitality are the sectors where the COVID has impacted the most, then this is very well explained. The way digitalization exists, but also the way the digitalization and IT components are studied. And we do have information to measure that, how much IT these sectors have, infrastructure, so on and so forth. However, COVID has given us the extreme shocks and crises and events. So my reflection is that if we try to look for some order in this dialogue, I think that there is some bias towards the steady state of the electrical sector. So we were where we were, we had the renewables, there is a decentralization phenomenon, then we have digitalization that enters, demand is also pushing. And so we think that all those things make us think about the implications on commercialization and distribution, and we think less on the distribution of the system and the network itself. And so we could say this is very much related to quality, but externalities is a point of great concern. And this is important because of another reason in Latin America. The network has the characteristic of being a public good, that the renewable technologies and resources already started calling for further discussions. But I think that that deserves more attention. So I am describing, as you can see, a sort of tension between the economy and the electrical sector, where the component of a public good sort of gains relevance, and on the other side, there are pressures on decentralization and digitalization playing a key role. So that's a matter of trying to think and rethink, because it is related to government investments, public investments. We cannot consider capital stock and use current costs. We want to promote some sort of welfare state. However, that tension in financing aspects and the role of the public goods are hitting tensions. And so I have another comment to make that has to do with the regulatory paradigm. For me, this paradigm is not very well established in Latin America. So we, as economists, can talk about tariffs, fares, rates, and everything that digitalization does in the electrical sector and other sectors. We as economists could make recommendations as well, but we also need to think about this other side, the fiscal matters, the decentralization aspects that I think call for a further dialogue in a region which is stagnated and in the face of a world that is going to set a limit to natural resources. There is also a structural issue at stake, and the labor market too. And my last comment actually is an example of this tension that I am describing. The conclusions of the work talk about the distributive impact of financing. Personally, I think that the characteristic, the distributive characteristic, as we economists say, of digitalization is higher, is more pro-poor than what the work suggests. The work talks about concerns in two levels. First, the losses and consequences that would be felt by those who are using electrical energy. And second, the impact of digitalization in the downstream of commercialization and the emergence of business. The possibility of making dynamic fares, dynamic rates, that rules out the possibility of cross subsidies. So, if we take the view of extreme events and the role of digitalization in the management of smart networks in extreme events as we experienced in 2020, and we are going to continue experiencing in the future, we could say that digitalization has a very positive effect on distribution because it protects people who cannot be rescued in a different manner. Of course, we need to perfect this work, particularly because I'm thinking about this sort of moving towards, let's say, a third regulatory phase, that it will be perfected with lots of decentralization, when actually on the other side we have lots of financing problems. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Fernando. A very interesting presentation, very sharp comments about the impact of digitalization on the cost structure, on the industry, on public finances, and fiscal aspects too. And it was very interesting to hear you say about the capability of absorbing extreme shocks as COVID, and the resilience and this versatile nature of digitalization compared in developed countries and Latin America. Very interesting indeed. Now let's move to our second presenter, Germán Lieras, who's going to focus on transportation and digitalization in the sector. Germán is Regional Director of STEER Group for Latin America and responsible for the strategic direction of the company for the region. He has vast experience in very important projects for the development of infrastructure in Latin America. For instance, he participated in the first phase of the Transmillennial system. Germán holds a civil engineering diploma and also transportation degree from the MIT. Thank you, Germán, for being part of this session to make comments on the IDEAL 2021 report. Thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to congratulate Walter and the team for the drafting of this report and this data that they are putting at disposal of everybody. I have 6 comments. So let me see if I can make them very quickly. First, I participated in some of the input that later on Walter and his team used. And I would like to talk about the comparison between transports, means of transports. We discussed this with Walter. Maybe when we think about the framework of transportation, there is a difference in terms of the role of the city, the role of the transport. So we need to be careful when comparing these aspects because we need to have more context or background information. And in relation to the sector per se, the report mentions the convergences that are strengthened by the pandemic. First, convergence between people, mobility, electrical energy, and digitalization. This convergence paves the way for new regulatory spaces and markets that, as the report says, are not fully solved. Many countries in the region, for example, do not have a specific framework that allows to market electrical energy in buses, for instance. So they need to create mechanisms, pricing schemes, and how the electrical power is sold in order to charge buses, for instance. Then a market was created for electrical vehicles, but again, buses are lagging behind. Not Chile or Colombia or Brazil, where we see some advances. But if we talk about Central American countries, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, there is a need to move forward in that regard. So the convergence of these 3 points, I believe, that was reinforced by another convergence. This is a convergence of objectives, impacts, where the urban transportation for people has a key role. Of course, we could talk about interurban transportation, air transportation that were very much affected by the pandemic, of course, but the transportation of people is the focus of my presentation. And it's also the convergence in different levels that existed in the past but were not so specific, or we didn't need so much evidence. The first has to do with the notion of equity. Equity in a broad sense. Today, gender equity, age equity, education equity is increasingly more important. So the designs and the operations must meet the needs in those areas. Inequities that were very evident in the past. The second point has to do with climate change, which is a determining factor. Most Latin American cities today are trying to convert their fleets to have more electrical vehicles. Maybe Santiago de Chile and Bogota are taking the lead, but there is a strong pressure in order to accelerate the electrification of the motor fleets, mainly driven by the environmental need, but this also applies to this convergence that we see between mobility and electricity. And finally, related to COVID, how urban public transportation and its regulation could contribute to a very important element when we see the unemployment levels and the poverty levels, something that exists in Latin America. Public transportation still is a hope, a possibility, that lever to access work, to access recreational activities. And today, the financial and institutional situation is hard because much of the revenues that came from the transportation fares and rates are affected, and all the other needs are also hard hit. So in the end, the way how the public transportation is funded and financed is being affected. We need to rethink how these operations are conducted. And here comes another point that Walter mentioned and that we discussed today, pandemic has accelerated digitalization, and digitalization may be a protection mechanism for the poor. However, in public transportation, digitalization is lagging behind. That means that the transportation sector should start making investments in digitalization. It has done it in buses, trains, railway tracks, but the digitalization component of the transportation system should increase. For instance, some countries in the region have a single ministry of transportation and communication and telecommunications, in Mexico, for instance. But in other countries, these are sectors that are not connected, and they seem to be reluctant to breaking down those barriers. So this possibility of speeding up digitalization could finally create a greater push in the role that public transportation could play. And then there are 4 specific points where digitalization could make urban systems invest not necessarily more, but better. First, information for users. Whenever you design a train or bus road or route and the waiting times are really high, the traditional situation was to invest in more buses in order to reduce the time. However, now we have the possibility of improving communication. So people need to leave their house or their offices at the right time. So this is just a matter of making a more efficient use of the means of transportation, integrating these things to the times of the buses, times of the means of transport, developing better services, less expensive for users and for cities. So at the level of user information, this is key. Or the payment methods linked to blockchain, fintech, or the cell phone. This is also a great enabler for equity. And another important aspect where we can work on, for instance, Africa, they have lots of examples. Africa has many examples in the management of public transportation collection methods that reduces the transaction costs associated to public transportation. And finally, everything that has to do with assessment, planning, big data allows us to evaluate what's going on and plan better. So we are able to integrate information, payment, and assessment mechanisms, we will have a great result. Thank you, CAF, and I'll be at your disposal for anyone who would like to hear more from my comments. Thank you, Germán. Very interesting topics. Your global view trying to integrate these challenges of equity, financing, climate change, digitalization as well. It would be so good to have more time to keep on the discussion, right? And invite Walter into the discussion, but we have to stick to our agenda. We are going to move on to the policy panel. Thank you, Germán. Thank you, Fernando, for your comments on the Ideal Report 2021. Thank you, Ernesto. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Ernesto Jabrowski. he moderated these interventions that were very interesting. We would like to thank Fernando Navajas and Germán Geras also for their interventions. And before we continue, let me remind you that you can share your feedback. You can help us share all of this through social media. The hashtag we are using is IdealCAF. So with that hashtag, we will get together in social media, and we'll also follow. You can also follow us through the Twitter channel, which is at Agenda CAF. So in those two spaces, we will be sharing your feedback during the rest of this IDL 2021. Now, up next, we will be discussing public policies, and let me give the floor again to Antonio Cerveria, Vice President with Infrastructure in CAF, who will be leading this discussion with our guest. Welcome once again. Thank you very much, Lorena. Here I am again. I loved the definition of Fernando in the previous panel about the influencers. Here in the policies dialogue, we might say that we have a very important panel of people that, under the influence of influencers, have a very important role of bringing some light shown by influencers in order to, let me say, have an environment of consensus and implementation of solutions. And this always generates different sort of works. So we need to have a good technique and directly apply it. So the political component is extremely important, especially in such a disruptive topic as digitization of infrastructure, emphasizing on energy and urban transportation systems, as Fernando and Germán also mentioned in the panel coordinated by Ernesto. So our guests here who will contribute with their experience. First of all, we have the Minister of Transportation and Telecommunications in Chile, Gloria Hess. She's a civil engineer by the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile with a certificate in business administration and finance from the Georgetown University in the U.S. She has long experience in the government. She's been undersecretary between 2010 and 2014, undersecretary of transportation. She coordinated national transportation policy in Chile and other aspects of the development of public transportation as well. And she's also been coordinator and general administrator of Evopoli, party she founded. Unfortunately, Nicolas Estupiñán, he was called by the president of Colombia. So to replace him, we have Lina Quiñones. She's director of intelligence for mobility at the Secretariat in Bogota. She's an environmental engineer and economist by the University of Los Andes with a master's degree in urbanization and development by the London School of Economics. And last, but equally important, we have Felix Sosa, president of the National Administration of Electricity, ANDE, in Paraguay. He's an electrician engineer by the University of Ceará in Brazil, in my country, with a master's in business administration at Universidad Católica Nuestra Señora de Asunción, and master's in business administration by the Arturo Vargas organization. So here we will have a round of general questions, and then we will have some specific questions. I will start right away asking each of our speakers the following question, which has to do with digitization and sectors that are accountable for that. So I will start with Gloria. Good morning, Gloria. Can you tell us up to what extent you can have digitization as an ally in the sectorial challenges where you need to manage this transportation and telecommunications environment in Chile. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to this panel of such a relevant discussion for various settings. And it so happens that in Chile, the Ministry of Transportation is Transportation and Telecommunications. So we have these efforts in these two areas quite integrated. And I think it's important to tell you that prior to applications in transportation, we've been having a strong effort to cover fiber optics and also to close the digital gap. So as to have availability of the right infrastructure in telecommunications in order to solve and meet the needs for different type of transactions. Specifically in transportation apps, there's one that has already been mentioned by the previous speakers. The main one is the possibility to capture and provide information. Sensorization. German and some other specialists in transportation probably remember how difficult it was to obtain data on trips or on traffic, for instance, and you could take samples and extrapolate those samples, and we assume that the system behaved the same every day for several months, and that is not true. Digitization and current media allows us to have a reflection of what's going on at every single moment on the street and also size different solutions. We are also deploying 5G, and soon we will have a possibility to have a fast reaction in the Internet of Things, communication among objects, and be able to regulate traffic flows according to immediate loading of information. Also inform users that electronic payment systems are also a breakthrough. The road control, the control of compliance with service contracts are important. Mainly, those are the environments we have very much focused on having the whole digital environment to favor the good service of public transportation. We want to maintain high involvement in cities in this way, in a massive way. To do so, we need to increase our quality. Therefore, we have included a lot of technology. All new buses have free of charge Wi-Fi, so people can be connected and can make cooperation. So digitization in transport is not only focused on a better planning where we can know exactly what's going on, but also in the improvement in the quality of trips for people, for users. Thank you very much, Gloria. It very much touches upon very important aspects not long ago, but we still think it's more than a century that there was a huge problem, a really headache for logistics workers, which is the studies of origins and destinations, and we had to have people on the streets counting. But let me move on now to Lina. Lina, according to your experience in managing a city with such a nice traffic, so to speak, as Bogota. So how does digitization support your work and helps you facing these risks, these challenges, sorry? Thank you, Antonio. And thank you very much. I'm very happy of being part of this very important panel. Digitization, specifically in the case of traffic, has helped us in two ways. Basically, in terms of information, as responsible for the management of mobility in Bogota, it helps us recover real-time information of what's going on in the streets. So, as Gloria was saying, at one time we had to wait to see what was being reported by the people in the street and have important deployments of staff, counting vehicles, or taking information on the field. And now we can do all that through different sensors and cameras and different digital tools. In Bogota, we have a very important bet on going from our center of traffic management, which has 123 cameras all around the city, several sensors, and turn it into a smart transport system that help us recover more and better information and also make or take actions in a faster manner. The other part of how digitization can help us in managing the traffic is by providing better information to users. So we know that users who have better information make better decisions. They can make decisions that are better for them in terms of which bus to take or wait to the following bus or what are the roads they have to take. We've seen this with several apps that we have in the marketways, Google Maps. And so with this constant flow of information both ways in real time, this is what really can help us improve traffic for a specific case that you're asking about. But again, information and all the potential that we have available now with new technologies is very important because it does not only help us in everyday management to respond to an incident or providing alternative routes to users, but also helps in planning long-term policies, better responding to the user's needs, to the already observed needs, and seeing how these mobility patterns or needs change every day. And let me again mention that it's not assuming that the city moves in a specific way one day and it will continue to do so the following day. This never happens, so we need to plan beforehand in order to meet these needs. Thank you, Nina. I mentioned Bogota because I've been living there for 2 years and I had the experience that having an app-assisted mobility really helps you a lot. Okay, let's continue with Felix to listen about the electrical sector. Felix, how has digitization helped you in challenges of promoting smarter networks in Paraguay? Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Let me congratulate Walter for this event, a very important event, and it's really very important specifically for the sector we are in. Thank you very much, Mr. Antonio Silveira, for giving us this opportunity. And the digitization system is really fundamental for the electrical sectors, more so for the commercial and electrical power distribution areas. Right now, I wanted to divide this into three segments, considering that ANDE is a vertically integrated company that generates, transmits, and commercializes and distributes electrical power in Paraguay. This is the only the only company in the country where digitization is really contributing a lot in order to deploy the contingency control system so that both systems can work, both the system that feeds by the hydroelectrical power plant in Itaipu that we share with Brazil, and the system feeding in terms of hydroelectrical plant we share with Argentina. So we are now about to implement this contingency control system in a digitized manner. It's a whole challenge to make it work in an integrated manner in this country. On the other hand, in the commercial aspect, it has enabled us to have a better relationship with our customers. We have an app where the customer can conduct almost all operations, queries, payments, new connections. That is to say, the customer today can do almost anything that has to do with the commercial setting. And apart from doing this, this also help us to get more information on the part of the customer. They are more active, and in that way, we can also make more proper decisions and prioritize decisions in those areas based on the claims of customers that are received online. This is very important because we can better direct investments. That is to say, we can optimize investment and we can also prioritize them. On the other hand, in the distribution area, it is fundamental in order to optimize the operation of the distribution system and also in order to speed up the reestablishment or the restoration of a service. Of course, that depends a lot on the installation of the telecommanded devices. So for us, it is really fundamental and it's an ally for us. I mean, telecommunications is an ally for us. Also within the master plan of ANDA, we only had the generation, transmission, distribution areas, but today within our recently launched master plan with a 10-year horizon, we've already included on a separate basis the telecommunications master plan to really deploy it and also support the whole digitization process for the whole and the management. So, Antonio, for us, it's really very important to follow this path, and we see results specifically in our relationships with customers, and also it allows us to make our management more transparent. The customer knows and is able to get more information in a faster manner on the part of ANDA in this case. Thank you very much, Felix. It's good that CAF is a hand that helps ANDA in this sense from the financing point of view and also from the technical cooperation. We've been having a long relationship with you. But now, what has to do with infrastructure? Well, many times, specifically in logistics and transport, it talked about connectivity, and this has been so since Adam Smith's time, with the idea that the deepening of the division of market depends on the expansion of the market. So connectivity and the relation with infrastructure has always been a very important topic, and some regions in Southeast Asia, they addressed investment in infrastructure as collectivity among productive chains. So let me say it this way. The physical connectivity started to compete with digital connectivity, and then things started combining with each other. But last year, with the pandemic, we've had a disruption of physical connectivity for a few months. So this generated a situation where society had to connect for different matters, whether it was work or family, etc., in a digital manner. So this generated a lot of pressure on digital infrastructures, but it also generated an acceleration of digitization in all environments. So I would like to listen from our panelists to see what were the challenges that you had to face during the pandemic. Let's start with Gloria, please.
Thank you. Of course, that in addition to the great impact that we all had during the pandemic, we would say that there were strong impacts on transportation and telecommunications in particular. So the lockdown forced us to put our connections onto digital platforms. And the digital platforms were designed for different functions. So, for example, at the offices, there was a certain capacity to manage big documents with dedicated lines, and in households, capacities were different. So the first challenge was not a capacity challenge per se. We had network capacity, but the problem was that the companies could set up those capacities because everybody started living, work from home. So our requirements changed completely. Our internet subscription plans, for example, were different. They had different setups. Many people didn't have an internet connection altogether. So a great effort had to be made for companies to set up the service. Some were able to do it faster, others took longer, and that had a very negative effect. Many people saw their capacity deteriorated. So currently it is quite stabilized. On the other hand, from the public policy standpoint, special plans had to be made. So particularly for low-income people who had connection issues. So together with the companies, a free connection plan was established for education sites, coronavirus websites, and also access to emails and text. So people who didn't have connection were included, were not excluded. And in case someone had to get a message, could also get a message. That was a huge challenge. On the other hand, we had to adapt, and this is in the transportation area, cities for lockdown. So there, we had to make a follow-up and a tracking of the movements. We made a very detailed analysis of mobile phone signals so that we could identify how people moved and what were the reactions to the quarantine, the level of adherence and compliance. So the digital component was key. At the ministry, we had been in the digitalization project for 2 years. And my impression is that without COVID, we would have been 5 more years in the same thing. However, in 2 weeks, our ministry became fully digital. Also, we were ready, but we didn't take the step that the COVID finally forced us to. Or, for instance, if someone asked a certificate, we would deliver it through digital means, and only then we validated. So those things had to be adapted. However, all in all, the ministry is capable of working digitally, fully digital. That was a huge challenge. We had to reconfigure the networks. We had to work on the coverage, particularly those who didn't have access, and also get the public sector continue with the capacity to give service without deteriorating the responses. So we had to work on several fronts, keeping the supply chain active as well. And the use of means of non-conventional means of transport that would also be scheduled and generated on the digital platforms. So the pandemic, I would say, was key in order to multiply actions and to diversify actions. In addition to private enterprises that also developed elements to control, to report symptoms, anything that was necessary in order to make this economic life sustainable through the digital platforms. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you for your comments in relation to accelerating the digitalization of the state. This is a huge challenge. Lina, what about you? What about your experience in this acceleration of digitalization in your city? Well, in Bogota, at the end of 2019, we launched the mobility survey. The most recent one is already obsolete, actually, because people were not moving in 2020. The last time they moved was in 2019, so we had to rethink. We said we cannot make another survey. We were in a situation where we couldn't say that people would move in May the same way as in June, because the moving patterns were changing a lot. So we had to rethink how to capture information as to how people moved in Bogota, how to use digital tools better, and the sensors that we had at our disposal, from a very basic action of taking a photo and putting it to the service of analytics, trying to devise new processes and new technologies to see how mobility was changing week by week, because particularly in 2020, from April to September, every week had new economic sectors that changed. So people who go to work from such and such sector had a specific pattern that also affected public transportation. But all in all, this has pushed us to using better technologies. The Secretariat had to digitalize many procedures. Colombia, as you know, is a very face-to-face country. People are very much used to going physically to institutions, to the offices. So that was a challenge, making all these processes online. And in relation to these community aspects, that was a huge challenge. The pandemic has made people be very much reluctant to go into crowded places. So in Colombia, we started to see a dropout of 35% in public transportation, but now we have the regulation of 70% maximum capacity. And we saw that there was a mobility and a difference in the use of public transportation. However, we know that public transportation has proven to be not such an important point of infection, because people follow a protocol. People really have this preference for public transportation. So we had the challenge of recovering the users that left and prevent users from choosing, for instance, a motorbike or their private cars. This is a challenge we are working on. And in this line, we also implemented a new exception. We know that demand management in Bogota was based on the plate restriction. This is a numbering system that we use to allow cars to go out into the street. It's a system that we've used for many years, and it's very hard to change. We try to implement it because of some peak hours, so on and so forth. But the plate numbering system that we have is a system very much wanted by people. So we are trying to work on the system. Last year, we implemented the exception of paying through SMS or shared mobility. So people who would have 3 or more passengers on the car could register the vehicle at the beginning of the week, and they would be exempted from the plate numbering protocol that we have. They can do it through the web page or through text. And this was an important discussion because we were in the midst of the pandemic, and so it was a huge challenge. we decided to go for it because in many cases we thought that the car sharing was going to be conducted by people who already lived in the same house or were relatives. But on average, we have 30,000 vehicles recorded every week. And we have this good car sharing modality that was very successful. And this has helped us in one way or other to compensate and to offset this idea that people started refraining from public transportation. So this car sharing was very interesting for us. And our temporary bicycle lanes that used to be temporary but now are permanent. So the bicycle lanes were also a response to the mobility. So we know that people have come to choose the bicycle, which is sustainable and more efficient than the private car, for example. Yes, that's a very good point. And it was an impact of or an effect of the pandemic, the increase in the number of bicycles, which is like the national sports in Bogota, right? So I'm very glad that it was used. So moving on to Felix. Felix, how was your experience with the digitalization in Andes under COVID and this acceleration for the digital aspect? We know that Paraguay at the very beginning of the pandemic was like isolated, right, with little effects. However, just like Uruguay, after the second wave, Paraguay was hard hit. So tell us how this move of digitalization in COVID impacted Andy, and what about the experiences? Well, Antonio, we had positive and negative experiences. On the positive side, I think that like any business in the sector, we had to speed up the digitalization of the system. Home office, telework, and all those notions that in one way or other accelerated our interaction with customers. So everything that has to do with communication with customers and clients was absolutely enhanced. We even directed our resources in that regard in order to improve customer service and above all the part of the system operation and system distribution. But we didn't have such a good experience in relation to the meter readers. The government took a very quick decision on isolation measures. So the readers didn't go out to make the readings. So in general, our methodology was to take the readings based on consumptions. But this time, the billing was made based on the history. However, the consumption behavior changed absolutely. So 3 cycles later, when the readings normalized according to the metering devices, there was a surprise in the billings. And so it was very hard to normalize the situation and to persuade people that the bills related to an accumulated consumption. On top of that, people stayed at home, worked from home, so the household scenario really had an impact. And then on the business side, of course, the billing was made based on a history as well, but the opposite occurred. They were billed actually over their consumptions. So for us, our experience is a very important lesson learned. Even though the Andes application allows the user to follow the consumption, so on and so forth, unfortunately, not everybody follows the consumption. So this is why we are convinced that it is very important to install smart metering devices so that they can be measured remotely and built remotely. This is a key change that we need on top of the optimization of resources so that we can use our resources, particularly for the commercial operations. This experience was very important. And also, there is a, let's say, an increased need to finally install the smart metering devices as a solution to this problem. Now, the challenge is to define to what level of consumption we need these metering devices, smart devices. Today, 99% of our meters are digital but are not smart. So the point would be, which technology are we going to use for these mechanisms? Is it necessary to change over all those metering devices, or can we use and upgrade those devices? And also, what level of communication do we need? And to what extent, what level of consumption do we really need to make these investments? I'm trying to set the cost benefit of the equation. So it is a great challenge for us. We are working hard on this, and we are making deep analysis to start deploying these technologies. We know that 80% of the invoicing of Andy is paid by 20% of customers. So this is the reason why our intention is to start installing the smart meters for those 20% customers. However, considering how the map is scattered around the country, we need to think about what will be the best communication system. The Paraguayan Chaco area, where we don't have any communication there, of course, that will be a huge challenge. This is what we need to define, where to start. But definitely, we have no doubts that the only path to go is installing the smart metering devices. This is a learning that we got from the pandemic. Thank you, Felix. And now let's change the order of my questions, if I may. And I would like to continue with you in relation to network digitalization, digitalization in general, but the networks per se. We have international examples in this sense, particularly cybersecurity for this critical infrastructure, right? Because one thing is the damage we could have with the digital infrastructure at certain levels, but new risks are appearing here, particularly in energy networks. So I would like to hear from you how Andy is reacting to this topic now that you are taking a close look to the smart metering systems. How are you preparing for this? Well, it is a very important point, you know, that in communications is fundamental to digitalize the electrical sector, but one of the main pillars is security. This is why we signed a cooperation agreement with CAF in order to make a deep analysis in terms of cybersecurity. This is fundamental for us, and I believe that in parallel to digitalization, information security must be clearly defined, not just for the benefits of protecting the assets of an institution, but also our customers and clients. So, Antonio, I think that's a huge challenge we need to face, considering that there are some isolated experiences in that regard, too. But it is for us fundamental, and this is why we signed this agreement with CAF in order to lay the groundwork in cybersecurity in particular, and to execute projects that could have digitalization in parallel. Another point has to do with people's training in terms of digitalized systems of ANDE in this case, and the support to the customers. It's very important to educate customers so that they can work as much as possible. In relation to cybersecurity, and another challenge that comes to my mind is the registration of the smart grids. This is where we need to start. So where do we start? Do we start from the smart metering devices? Do we start from the communications? Okay, where do we start? This is the challenge that we need to overcome. There's no need that we have to digitalize, but we need to consider the registration of the equipment that is installed. And of course, IT security is fundamental. Thank you, Felix. Thank you. And this thing that you just said, it's key. The smart grids, where to start? From CAF, as you may know, we really like to support. And now moving on to Gloria, in this change of order, I would like to ask Gloria, please tell me about the programs to leverage digital transformation in Chile. We talked about pandemic, digitalization. So what are the plans to accelerate the digital society in Chile?
Thank you very much. We are really very ambitious. We call it the digital matrix. It's a 3-axis: users, infrastructure, and coverage. And in each of these, we have different projects. CAF has been a protagonist here, let me say, because you've allowed us to move forward in the deployment of a cable that connects Latin America with Asia. So that is moving along really very well, because CAF also funded the feasibility studies. So the closing of the digital gap project has several aspects. One is the coverage of infrastructure. As I said, this is a fiber optic infrastructure of all the comunas in the countries that creates a public road of optic fiber that works together with some other roads from companies, that is to say, private optic fibers. This is a public one that can be used by all companies, and it allows us to get to the most isolated areas that would not be addressed by the private companies, for example, by being subsidized by the state. It also complements with resources from regional governments for the deployment of the last goal. And the objective is to connect households with fixed internet, and that is the big gap that we need to close. We've covered approximately 60% of households, but having a fixed internet coverage is really very important because this allows us to transfer large volumes of data, do large transactions, also access to audiovisual material. So that is our big challenge. On the other hand, within the coverage environment, we have free Wi-Fi, also with subsidies from the states, and we are moving forward to 2,400 points of free Wi-Fi. We also have connectivity for education. We have connectivity of all of Chilean schools with the deployment of 5G. There is also an obligation by giving the band to the companies. They have to fulfill 90% of the population in all public hospitals. So we believe that with all of that, we will have a good basis of infrastructure. But we need to add to that the access. And access has different components, not just signal, but also the quality of the signal, which is also part of the 5G deployment. And also the capacity of payment. That's why we need to have special plans, for instance, for people with lower income. We don't want to have a new gap. Our countries in Latin America, we're always trying to close gaps. And this gap can be anticipated. If we work in advance, we can avoid that the next gap, which is a digital gap, again lives behind a large proportion of the population. So that's why we are aiming at those groups that are most vulnerable. And there's a third access element, which is digital literacy, and that affects the older people, those who have had no contact with the digital world. So there is an effort for training and education in order to use digital tools. And with the deployment of digital infrastructure, we also have this connection to Asia that I mentioned, that CAF has been a very important player to make it possible. And we hope that all the campaigns that we have to promote investments and, for instance, guaranteed speed of connection, we hope that we can increase our standard and we can have people with access, not just with coverage, because coverage, you can have it in different ways. And in fact, we have over 96% of the country already with coverage, for instance, with mobile telephony, but quality is quite diverse. And there's better quality on urban areas, which are the more commercial ones. So that's what we are fixing. We are demanding quality on all new deployments. So we have connectivity for education. And there's something new also that could also be used for what our colleague from the Paraguayan company also mentioned, which are very remote, very small areas. In those cases, we are making an experiment with Starlink, which is Elon Musk's company, and we will have two very small locations that will be connected via satellite to internet. And with that, connection costs of satellite internet for those very small locations are much lower than covering it with optic fiber or mobile telephony. So this is a complement. That is to say, we cover 90% with what I've explained before, but we still have a very dispersed layer of population with very remote locations in the mountain range, for instance, and in those cases, we'll give them connection via satellite. So I hope we can close the gap because there's a lot of effort in that. Thank you very much, Gloria. Honestly, it's really very interesting to see the Chilean approach that is seeking for all dimensions to provide basic infrastructure on the part of the supply, also education of people, human capital, quality, and especially this focus on preventing digitalization to be a source of inequality. So this is really very important matter for a region which is characterized for the very high qualities of inequality as is Latin America. So thank you very much also for mentioning the cable, which is my métier in this case. But it's an honor for CAF to be involved in this as well. Okay, so let's continue with Nina. Why don't you tell us a little bit about plans that has Bogota in terms of digitization and integration of public transport services, and also the urban logistics look, if you can, and knowing that Nicolas has long experience with that. So I think that within this secretariat, you also have part of this DNA. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it, Lina? Of course, Antonio. So as I said before, our big bet is the smart transportation system, is to turn our data center into a smart transportation system that will help us predict in a short term what's going to happen and how to better react to any incident if there is a rainfalls, to improve traffic, but also to collect better information in order to have medium and long-term policies. This is, for instance, the installation of sensors and cameras, and assessing different types of cameras and sensors that are no longer used in order to have a surveillance of people, or also for video analytics, for different strips, and something that allows us to better manage the mobility in the city. And also, as I said, to migrate from the traditional methods of data collection that requires a lot of people on the field to data collection with technological tools, and also generate some alerts through this tools. We are also working with predictive traffic devices that allows us to predict the short term with certain variables what's going to happen and have a better management of mobility. Also, in this regard, we are again exploring the demand management. We are reviewing um, payments through distance run, checking the use of a public space, also management and collection of public space in the case of parking in streets. Bogota has no parking in the streets. We've really tried to implement that on the city, and we are doing another one. We hope it comes out. So we want to see how to use technology sensors and our smart transport system in order to better manage the use of public spaces. And also, we are checking the public transport rates. We have a big bet there also with a general policy beyond digitization, which is getting much more egalitarian and inclusive rate system that guarantees access to the city and the opportunities offered by the city, and that all the population can access to that, especially in the most vulnerable populations. The rate scheme in Bogota was defined mostly on the financial sustainability of the system, which is really very important. It's important that the system has something to work with, but we are trying to give it some kind of swap towards equality, to see the benefits and opportunities that are being offered, to check whether the ones that we currently have are the ones that we need or maybe not, or what are the populations that are being left behind. We are very much focused on access to opportunities for the whole population. Here we have another challenge in terms of technology and digital services. We have the Transmillennium that used to work with zonal buses, and now we will have the metro and the Regiotram in the future. So we need to integrate and manage to interoperate all of these different transport systems. So we're working a lot on how to achieve that through technology, so that the user service is the best. Internally speaking, within the mobility sector, as a secretariat, we are the head of the mobility sector, the different units, the transportation unit as well, among others. And we are working to improve the way in which we share data, so that it's not just one person sending an Excel spreadsheet every day at 5 p.m. via email, but rather looking to see the APIs so that TransMillennium people can access the data from the Secretariat and that they know that their most recent data, that they are in real time, that they are updated every 15 minutes or every hour, but that they can always have a direct access and not look for a specific contact that is sending that spreadsheet. So we are developing a very interesting data center that also help us integrate all of the data sources and also translate them, because there's a challenge here because our sensors are there, but they speak one language and the people needing the information does not necessarily speak the same language. So we also need to translate that to put it into charts that can be understood by people. Otherwise, we will always end up consulting the same person that knows how to read the data from the sensor, and that's not good. Also here, the automatic generation of alerts on different aspects, not just on incidents or traffic jams. But for instance, if we see that there are too many accidents in a month, we start seeing what's going on. And also consolidating information from these traditional methods of taking information on the field that are still being used and see how to integrate it in one single database and cross them with some other sources of information and make them more intelligent. And last, our last bet that we hope comes out soon is the Mobility Observatory. The idea is to have a communication tool with citizens to provide very clear and understandable information, not to mobility experts or academics. We have an open portal of data so that users or journalists or anyone who wants to question, I don't know, average speed in Bogota or how many people move in a bus in a typical day, can also access that portal and ask that information that will be published there in a very simple way. So we have quite a lot of ideas in terms of logistics. We also have a challenge with New Habitat and several other allies in a program which is called Climate Smart Cities Challenge, where we will come up with a challenge for entrepreneurs worldwide that will help us develop some kind of control tower for logistics in Bogota so that we can better manage it in order to benefit logistics companies, benefit cities and the users of the transportation system. And based on all of that information and digital tools, we are able to have a better organized city with better mobility for us all. Thank you very much, Lina. So count on us. We have Soria de Sanken in Bogota, a very important specialist that can also help in this effort. So we are reaching the end. Walter's big team sent one last question for each of you that had to do with how data impacts on your work. But I think that you've all spoken a lot about this. So I would like, I know Pablo is looking at me a little bit worried, and Ernesto has his hands in his head. But I would like to give you 1 minute to all of you for some closing remarks of such a rich panel with all of your experience. And now changing order again. Let's start with you, Lina. You have 1 minute for your closing remark. Thank you, Antonio. Well, my closing remark is that we should bet on this. And as Gloria said, without COVID, maybe we would not have seen the urgency of digitizing in all aspects. We are quite comfortable with how things were working. And we really need to move towards providing services in a digital way, towards making the most of technologies and tools that the market is offering to us. And in this way, in the case of mobility, as I said before, have a better management of the passengers displacement and also goods displacement, but in generally in all environments, it's really, really very important. And I think the report that you shown, Walter shown, was really very interesting. A lot of things to consider in order to feed our processes and decisions. Thank you very much, Felix. Closing remark, please. Thank you very much, Antonio. I think that this is the way to get the trust of people, of customers, of the electric sector, with the possibility of always having information in a fast manner online and make all decisions of the company transparent in this case. On the other hand, I also value a lot, and I hope that this sort of events continues so that we can get the experience from other countries in the region. I'm a little bit worried about the registration of the equipment used. The European Union has good experience. They've also been through this. So I would like to be able to continue sharing information of this kind so that in different companies in various countries, we can make informed decisions, long-term decisions, so that we can benefit from the digitalizations of the administration. Thank you very much. Thank you, Felix. Gloria? Gloria, you are muted. I'm sorry about that. So let me start by anticipating the gap. I think that we do have a chance to act in time, unlike some other gaps that have also affected Latin America. And we know how to do this. We know how much it's worth, and we know how important it is. So I think it's an important challenge in public policies, which is to anticipate and prevent or avoid a digital gap that will impact many people's lives. Second, I think that we need to be open-minded and see things in a different way. The digital world allows us to see a supply. For example, in public transportation, we might have a platform where we can see different seats, and you might choose one of those seats. And the system, in a few years, might also configure the supply according to those requests. So we need to think out of the box. I think that the digital world will provide lots of opportunities, and 5G, particularly with a very low latency, those immediate response times, will allow us to manage systems through robots in a very efficient manner, but that also demands an open mind. And I would like to thank CAF also for all the effort you make in stressing the need for digital work to help the development of Latin America. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gloria Hodges from Chile, Lina Quiñones from Bogota, Felix Sosa, President with ANDA, for this very rich panel. And now we will listen to Pablo Sanguinetti to close the session. Thank you very much. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you to the speakers. It's been a very rich panel. Those of you here and those who joined this meeting, the Ideal 2021 meeting, we will now close. And now we'll listen to Pablo Sanguinetti, Vice President of Knowledge with CAF. Welcome.
Thank you, Lorena. It is a pleasure for me to close this meeting with few words. The discussion has been very rich. We used more time than we had, but it's a pleasure. I'm not an expert in all of the topics that you mentioned, but I really enjoyed the presenters' comments. And as we saw, the Ideal report proposes a comprehensive view of infrastructure, but putting the emphasis on services, emphasizing how infrastructure is important in the quality of life of families and productivity of companies. And in this view of infrastructure as a service, this issue of gaps is very important. Walter mentioned this. And the discussion also mentioned is the importance of measuring gaps in terms of accessibility, quality, and affordability, and digitalization that is affecting many sectors of the economy is also impacting infrastructure, in particular these two sectors, electricity and public transportation. So the idea is that digitalization can play a key role in reducing these gaps, as Jolina and Gloria mentioned, the applications to improve public transportation. Felix also mentioned this importance for the transportation and transparency-wise, how businesses manage information in a transparent manner. But also this comprehensive view that the report provides not only talks about closing gaps, but also opens up some space in public policies beyond the traditional investment scenarios. And a very relevant area here is the institutional and regulatory aspects regarding markets, fares, and rates. Digitalization in particular has to do with innovation, and so in line with improving with innovation, we do need the private sector, but under certain regulatory frameworks that ensure the incentives to innovate. This is key. And a second policy area has to do with public policies. That is to say, the state are not only concerned about having the participation of the private sector, but the public sector is also concerned because the gaps are closing. But what happens with equity and equality aspects, as Gloria mentioned, and also the environment that was very well mentioned by Germán as well, how digitalization has to make a sustainable improvement. And a final relevant aspect that was also mentioned, cybersecurity. You know that Felix mentioned this, and with digitalization, we have more information, we are more efficient, but what happens with the fact that this information could be misused? So once again, this discussion has been very relevant, very rich. To us, as a multilateral institution, we get a lot of feedback and input to keep on working, supporting governments. CAF is very much committed to finally get to concrete actions in reform projects, in investment initiatives, and support regional, local, and national governments for the achievement of a better infrastructure, which is key for countries, particularly in this post-pandemic stage that has very much affected countries and that also opens up new questions that we need to answer. So once again, thank you all very much. Thanks to all our panelists, public policy commentators, we could say, Walter and his team, and Tony. Thanks to everyone who is listening to us and being part of this interesting event. Thank you, Pablo, for your closing remarks. And to all participants who are connected to this seminar and this discussion part, you can find the report, the full report at cioteca.caf.com. This is the site, as you can see on the screen, for you to find the full report, to check data, to read it through. And on behalf of CAF, I would like to thank all participants and everybody who has been with us today. Thank you very much. Have a good day.